a story from a friend, which I did write about in my newsletter. She was in like the workplace, and somebody who was in a senior leadership position kept telling her like, oh, you're ADHD, oh, it's a superpower, it's a superpower. But then when she started to encounter like the challenges, you know, conveniently associated with having ADHD, it was like the complete opposite like reaction.
That was Parul Singh, a Tech Careers Neurodiversity Consultant who used to work as a tech recruiter. In a previous episode, we learned a ton from Parul about what recruiters look for in developers and how you can stand out to increase your prospects. I wanted to speak with Parul again because she's an empathetic expert on neurodiversity in tech whose perspective is rooted in her own lived experience with ADHD and autism. Neurodiversity in tech is fairly prominent. A lot of developers are neurodivergent. In this episode, you'll learn more about what exactly that means so that we can understand and work together more effectively. Even more than that, hearing someone like Parul talk about their experience and so eloquently describe their feelings and the way they tick might help you understand yourself a little bit better and become more effective in whatever you want to do. If you've listened to the previous episode with Parul, you will know that she is a super inspiring, eloquent, and motivating speaker, so I know you're going to enjoy this episode and you're going to take a lot of insights away from it as well. I'm your host, Alex Booker. You're listening to the Scrimmer podcast. Parul, welcome to the show. I know since last time you were on, there's been a few changes. What's new in your world?
Feels like only a few weeks have passed, but a lot has changed since the last time you had me on. And I actually quit my job about less than 2 months ago. And I am just about to, at time of recording, launch my own business focused on neurodiversity consultancy and training in the workplace. So I have been an employee for almost like the last 6 years. So it's really scary, but like a really exciting new venture. And I'm just so excited to get started because it really feels like the right move for me. And I think it allows me to really follow like my like passion for, you know, neurodiversity advocacy in the workplace.
In a past life, you're a recruiter, and our previous episode was all about advice for new developers breaking into tech. And we got some wonderful insights about how to stand out, navigate the job process. And we even spoke a little bit on salary and negotiation and things like that. One of my favorite episodes in recent times. And then towards the end, we started talking a little bit about neurodiversity because I know it's a big part of your story. And clearly now it's an area in which you're focusing further as you build a business around it. I was hoping we could learn a bit more about neurodiversity. And I thought perhaps a good place to start would be with some definitions to help frame our conversation.
So yeah, definitions is always a really, really good place to start. And there are actually so many in this area. So we are just going to kind of like focus on the key ones. So someone who is neurodivergent is someone who has a neurodivergent condition like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's. And someone who is neurodivergent will see, process, and experience the world in a different way. The inverse of this is neurotypical. And I do believe that there is no such thing as like a typical brain, but for argument's sake, neurotypical just means somebody who doesn't have a neurodivergent condition. And then the other main one is neurodiversity. If you don't know a lot about this, the way that I like to explain it is kind of like biodiversity. So if you're looking at like an ecosystem and you're describing it as like biodiverse, that means that, you know, there are so many different types of like species within that. So neurodiversity is like the infinite variations of the human brain.
The naming is almost it's kind of unfortunate. Like you could say that typical sounds like a good thing and divergent sounds like a bad thing, but I like the way you frame it.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily good or bad, it's just different, right?
The difficult thing as well with that is a lot of the conditions have like disorder, and it's sort of like, it's very kind of like the medical model is just, it's very sort of like deficit focused. So it's like you are missing this thing, like you can't do this thing. And I really like the way that you explained it. It's like a different way of like thinking, and that's what makes them different to like mental health conditions, because mental health conditions, in fact, they are deficits of something. Like, you know, if you have like clinical depression, you're missing the serotonin in your brain, for example, they are very different. And I think that's where some of like the challenge actually like comes from, like the perception that it's like, you know, like a bad thing. And I don't know how many people actually know this, but like scientists have actually deduced that dyslexic people were like critical for the survival and evolution of the human species. There is actually a theory of evolution called complementary cognition. It basically boils down to the sum of our parts. So somebody with dyslexia versus somebody like without dyslexia are basically like the sum of their parts. And you can use that, you know, for like all of like the like conditions. So
I feel like I have complicated feelings about it. And it's literally what you said. This idea that typical suggests people think the same and they are the same. No two brains are alike, first of all. And if everybody's brain was alike, that probably isn't very conducive to like evolution or a successful business or tech function, for example. I do think there's some education missing here around. It's very vast, isn't it? You know, and we talk about different types of conditions from ADHD to autism to dyslexia. We look at certain individuals who identify or are diagnosed with these conditions, and we could say that they are disabled. But then there are other people who thrive and function very well in a kind of professional environment, for example. I don't know. I guess there's a part here which is like something to do with scale. Like maybe it's not so binary. Like maybe these conditions take on different severities or different forms. I don't know if spectrum would be the right word, or a range or something like that. Could you talk a little bit more about the sort of like range of severity to do with these conditions and like people's perception of them versus what is really the case?
Yeah, I think stereotypes play a really, really big part in those. A lot of the diagnostic criteria is like heavily biased. There's a distinct lack of research done on not even just like women, but even like girls as well. A lot of it is done on like young boys. And then also like ethnic minorities are impacted sort of like differently. You know, we have these stereotypes in our head, and people who are neurodivergent are not immune to these as well, by the way. Like just because you have a condition doesn't mean that you don't still have, and we call this like internalized ableism, which is something that I never actually really, you know, understood was a thing. Is like, you know, how could I be ableist? I am disabled. Because of these sort of like stereotypes, like people think that you don't really like struggle with things. And like you said, it's so not binary. It can depend on like the situation. It can depend on the environment. It can depend on the day. Something which I think they're currently doing a little bit more research around it, but nobody checked how like the menstrual cycle impacts the effect of ADHD medication in women. So it can even depend on like where you are in terms of sort of like your cycle. So like I have like really good days and I have really bad days. I have days where something impacts me where like it just categorically wouldn't have actually like happened, you know, another day. And it's, you know, it's very fluid. For example, like if you join a new job, you're probably going to be overcompensating as a neurodivergent person. You're probably going to be masking, even if you've disclosed and like you're telling people, you don't really know how people are going to perceive you. So then you kind of like set this expectation in your colleagues and like your teammates' head of like, you know, what, for example, being like autistic means like for you. And then you feel like you kind of have to like keep that up. And it's really difficult. Like masking is so exhausting. And I realize I've mentioned that a few times and maybe not sort of like explained it. So if like anybody listening who isn't familiar with masking, the way that I like to explain it is kind of like camouflage, you know, for like animals, you know, like predators and like prey. So prey will camouflage themselves as a survival tactic. So it's like very, very similar. So masking is using coping mechanisms and, you know, camouflaging techniques to fit in, basically.
Yeah.
It's trying to suppress. You can never get rid of them. You can never hide them completely, but it's using enormous amounts of energy to like suppress your traits. And that happens because of a fear of like how you might be perceived.
Are autism and ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions, are they categorized as disabilities?
Yeah. Not every neurodivergent person will like class themselves as like being like disabled. Because again, that's sort of like stereotype that like disabilities are only like physical disabilities. Like you have to be in like a wheelchair or like missing like a limb. But despite some people not considering themselves to be disabled, they are very likely to meet the legal definition of disability. Which in the UK, and I think there are equivalents, I think it's like the ADA in America, but in the UK, it's called the Equality Act 2010. And something else which people don't always know is that you are also given protection by association. So if you have a child that is disabled, that requires, additional like medical care, something that might mean that, you need more like flexibility, or, you might get called out to like pick up your child from school as a result of their disability or the condition, you are protected from discrimination, victimization, and harassment, just as somebody with that condition would be.
The word disability is interesting because there's a subreddit dedicated to programming with ADHD with like millions of visitors. And this is clearly a very important topic in our industry. And we can, talk about why that might be in a second. But nevertheless, when we use the word disability, it's interesting because some people call like things like ADHD a superpower. One trait of ADHD, as I understand it, is that you could become hyper-focused and time-blind. Which imagine if you're on a coding task, someone could look with envy and say, wow, I wish I could be so focused.
I don't really like it. I think it's a lot of like toxic positivity. Yes, on one hand, like it is empowering trying to take something which society perceives as being like a negative, but it brings some good things. It's really like empowering to like, reclaim that for yourself. And I think it's something which is, potentially really powerful to be used in, younger children after sort of like being diagnosed. I think that's very important to them. But I think the other side of it is like how this can be like misconstrued and how it can be like actually like weaponized. So people who are neurodivergent come with a set of strengths, and they can be different strengths to potentially the neurotypical people in their team, but they will always come coupled with their own set of challenges. You cannot get one without the other. So when people will only accept the strengths, but refuse to accept and accommodate the challenges, that is where like the problems happen. Yeah. So that's why personally, I don't like the use of like superpower. And a story from a friend, which I did write about in my newsletter, which you can link if anybody wants to read it. But she, was in like the workplace, and somebody who was in a senior leadership position kept telling her like, oh, you're ADHD, oh, it's a superpower, it's a superpower. And it was, that was all, sunshines and daisies, whatever the saying goes. But then when she started to encounter like the challenges, conveniently associated with having ADHD, it was like the complete opposite like reaction. And then that's why like when we're talking about neurodiversity in like the workplace, why is it like important and everything? I'll admit I used to talk a lot about like the business sense behind it. We build better products and all these sorts of things, but there is that danger really. And I just think we deserve to exist. We deserve to have the same level of mental well-being as everybody else. We deserve the same opportunities, and we deserve to be able to thrive. Putting disabled people on a pedestal, I don't think it helps anybody.
What are some of the challenges and the downsides that, an employer would have to understand in order to also benefit from things like the creativity, the amazing creativity that can come when you see the world in a different way?
Every neurodivergent person is different, but I think it's even just the perception of what like a downside is actually. Like, is this thing really like a bad thing? One of the examples, being like autistic is like, I need clarity and I need to know the why. Example, joined a team, manager asked to do something, and I'm trying to get the clarity around it instead of just diving in. And I also kind of need to like understand like the why, because that's when it clicks in my head, and then I can go full throttle, I can hyperfocus on all those sorts of things. That can be like perceived as questioning somebody's authority. But then I think that is just more of a problem to do with like how somebody like perceives things. Like, why are you seeing it as questioning authority?
Yeah,
like, this is a very good thing. It's been shown. And I know just from like friends, like personal experiences as well, like having autistic people in your team who will like question the why, you will see the most innovation. Reframing what you think a downside really is, I think, is very important for an individual on their journey, but also a business on their journey.
How many people working in tech are neurodivergent?
The most recent large-ish scale study was by Beamer, which I think said about like 28%, but this was almost 5 years ago. And we know that a lot has changed since then. And there's a lot more like awareness, women getting like diagnosed, like myself, a little bit like later in life. Currently, the figure for like the general population is somewhere between sort of 15 to 20%. I think the percentage in tech personally is closer to like 35 to 40, but And, you know, a lot of people would potentially like disagree from, you know, sort of like what you say. So if we say, you know, it's almost like double, that's really interesting. Do you have any theories around why that might be, Alex?
I do actually. Neurodivergent people can be very creative. Coding and tech can be like quite a creative field. I think there is something about like, it's even, let's just use the example you gave, and it's only one example, wanting to know why. Perhaps even more than that, tech is a bit more forward thinking and accepting and accommodating. As long as your outcome is good, as long as you get the work done, as long as you're successful, it doesn't really matter how you got there.
Yeah, do you know what? You took the words out of my mouth. That is like exactly what I would say. I think sometimes like the nature of the work, we still have work to do. There will probably always be work to do. But when you look at different industries, see, I forget sometimes, I admit sometimes I'm in my like little echo chamber because I work in tech. I've worked in tech my entire career. All of my friends work in tech. But every now and then you talk to somebody like outside of the industry and you're like, wow, in comparison, we are very progressive. I'm really active in like the tech community, you know, I go into like the meetups and, you know, well sort of networked, and it really fills me with so much hope. And like, I talk to people and they will, you know, by their own admission say that like, I don't really know a lot about this. And, you know, I'm ashamed to say, but like, we're just not doing anything around this. Like we are right at the beginning of like our journey, but like, we really want to know where to start. And a lot of people are like in that position. If somebody's mind is made up, it's made up. If they're like, okay, neurodivergent people are like too difficult, I can't deal with that, it's too fast paced, like, you know, not my circus, not my monkeys. But I think that's really not the case for a lot of like companies here. I think people are genuinely so open-minded and just so willing to like learn, because the reality is that you've probably been working and managing a ton of neurodivergent people. You just maybe didn't explicitly know it. So
can we talk a little bit about masking in this context? Because in many industries and probably society, people expect you to behave a certain way, but you know, asking everyone to behave the same way isn't really reflective of how people's brains work. Really, we're all a bit different with different experiences. So when you go into the workplace and people expect you to behave a certain way and you kind of like adapt to that way of things, and you don't really want to, I think you said something like, you know, might be perceived as too fussy or, you know, too much hard work to work with someone neurodivergent. And like, it's all just coming together for me a little bit. It's like, if you feel that way, of course, you're going to be very reluctant to show that to the outside world.
I think this is why it's really important to give a platform for like people's like personal stories. So that's why like I do a lot of it on like my platforms and like my newsletter, because sometimes people aren't comfortable talking about it. And that's why sometimes maybe you think that things are a little bit, you know, further ahead than potentially like they are. I'm going to give an example, which is like specific to like tech and like software engineers. So like, I'm sure you're familiar with like paired programming and like mobbing and all those sorts of things. And, you know, probably a lot of like the listeners are, with this being the Scrumber podcast, but there are some companies, there's a few which actually just do all of their coding in a pairing or a mobbing sort of like environment. Personally, that is my idea of hell.
Interesting.
But some people really like it. I think that's absolutely okay. The companies define like how they work, and as long as like you're not hiding it from people until, you know, the moment they join, and they're like, basically you're going to be in a pairing session for 5-7 hours a day. You're like, oh good God, I've made a mistake here. Like that's fine. Like that's absolutely your sort of like prerogative. But there might be people who might not really know that they're neurodivergent. You know, an example where like, you know, my friend was like asking for like a little bit of like advice. How do you collaborate with people whose thought process isn't as quick as yours? How should the discussion be like handled? And, you know, saying that like she works with some people who, you know, have been diagnosed or displaying sort of neurodivergent like traits. And she said she could find it quite difficult keeping up with them when they're working together. And they were doing like a TDD exercise in a mob. And there's a guy who dominated the conversation and coding because he was just really excited to sort of like do it, which was great because his brain's obviously, you know, everything's like falling together and it's like, oh, I need to get it out. But there's other people in that situation. And, you know, she said like they had, you know, a conversation about it and he was like really, really apologetic. She said, you know, there wasn't a situation where I could just say like, I just need you to pause for a second, because he was maybe just so caught up in it. And you know what? Hearing that, I could not relate more. I just get lost in the sauce sometimes. I just go a little bit too quick, especially if it's something which is, you know, maybe a special interest of mine, or when things start to fall into place and I get really, really excited. And I'll admit, like, I do forget that I maybe need to slow down for like other people a little bit. Those situations can be very difficult for different neurotypes and different ways of communicating, even just introverts and like extroverts. So you can nip that in the bud or even prevent it from happening by like laying out the rules of engagement before you start these sorts of sessions. So this is great for like workshops. It's great for pairing sessions. It's great for like mobbing sessions, presentations, like you name it.
Yeah.
So if you would have said that, okay, this is, loosely the way that we're probably going to operate here, just so you know, we might have to stop you if you are dominating a little bit. We want to make it fair, because that makes it less awkward for like other people. Because, the fact that this guy was like apologizing profusely, like my heart breaks for him because I know how it feels.
Yeah.
I know how it's like, oh my God, I've done this. I've got lost in the sauce. And at the end of the day, like nobody does it like intentionally. Nobody wants to like dominate. Nobody wants to prevent other people from sort of like contributing. But, I think that situation probably like happens quite a lot. And I think, the solution can be quite simple. Or, maybe a little bit like less formal. Like if you do notice something is, maybe sort of like, bringing it up. So one thing which I find very difficult, which I later realized is part of sort of like autism, is not being able to read cues. So not knowing when it's sort of my turn to talk, or, reading somebody's facial expression that, oh, you're going on a little bit, or, get to the point, or let somebody else speak. I will not pick that up a lot of the time, which just makes it so difficult, because I think it kind of creates a sense of like resentment almost. And because that conversation's not really happening out in the open, I think that just kind of like accumulates. And this is why people who are neurodivergent, working in teams who kind of like lack the sort of like understanding, they will really, really struggle, because it creates this like sense of like separation. It's sort of like us and them. And have you heard of the double empathy problem? What it boils down to is that when people have different experiences of the world and they interact with one another, they will struggle to empathize. I think we have to accept that there's going to be a gap there. Somebody who is autistic interacting with somebody who is allistic, which is the term for without autism, are not always going to see eye to eye a lot of the time. I think sometimes like we just unfortunately have to accept that. And the more that like we try to understand that in like the workplace, I think that's when you have neurodiverse teams which will work together more like, cohesively. And I think part of this is the role of like technical leaders.
I agree. What I struggle with is like the kind of reality of the workplace sometimes. I understand people with ADHD can sometimes put off really hard tasks if they're not motivated to do it, compared to if they find it extremely interesting, they might get consumed by it. Another trait of ADHD might be that you're inattentive to detail, or it could be that you struggle to manage priorities and tasks and timelines. The advantage there is you can get so enthusiastic about it that you produce something that's incredibly productive. But what I think is not accepted is that managers want estimations, companies want deadlines, they want predictability sometimes. And like, I feel that tension there. And I think it's kind of frustrating, because like that is kind of the way of the world a little bit as it is today.
I think it's just kind of like, unfortunately, it's just modern corporate culture. I was in a breakfast roundtable a couple of weeks ago and we were talking about something sort of unrelated. And a phrase which kept coming up was delivery pressure. And I said, okay, I understand if like there is actually, something which has to be like delivered, or very bad thing happens, or, client sort of deadlines. But aside from that, like how much of this like urgency is actually real?
Yeah.
We don't work in A&E and nobody really kind of like questions it. And then that's what like neurodivergent people don't necessarily like understand. So if there's like a deadline, but like, why is that the deadline? If there's no reason behind it, you might potentially not take it seriously. If there is a justification, then you need to tell that person. And it's kind of looking at the bigger picture a little bit. And like, yes, there is a disconnect between like corporate like metrics, like ROI and like deadlines and like milestones and tickets and all those sorts of things, and like how a neurodivergent person actually views kind of like doing things in like the workplace. Like it's really interesting. I think it's something that like I would love to look into like a little bit more from like a technical perspective. So, if there's neurodivergent people listening to this and you're like, oh, do you know what? Yeah, I've got an experience with that. Like I'd love to hear about it. At the end of the day, productivity is very subjective. You can't always measure your productivity by the number of tickets that you've completed by the end of the day, by the end of the week. I've also become really obsessed with like productivity, sometimes to sort of like my detriment. And it's also how I overcompensated being undiagnosed ADHD, because I created all these like systems and I leaned so heavily on them, like my productivity systems and my strategies. So when they weren't there, then that's sort of like where I really struggled. I think I need to be a little bit more like in control, which is why I think the self-employment side probably works really well for me. There's an overwhelming number of people who are neurodivergent who do end up going like self-employed for this exact reason.
We're talking about neurodiversity in the workplace, and I don't know if you agree, but I feel like in the last few years, since the pandemic, for some reason, that feels like a good timeline to me. People have been talking about this a lot more, and they've been a lot more like considered with the language, and people often have these lived experiences and they feel bad for them. They feel bad for not fitting in and fitting in, not in a social sense necessarily, but more in the expectations of them do not align with them being natural with themselves. And it's leading a lot of people to start to like wonder, oh, maybe I do have ADHD or maybe I am neurodivergent. I know that you were diagnosed a little bit later in life. I think you mentioned last time you were 25. Tell me a bit about how your diagnosis came about, and was it a surprise to you?
I mean, it got to a point where like it wasn't really a surprise because everything just sort of like started adding up. So I was diagnosed almost exactly 3 years ago, and that was because I had hit such a wall and just nothing that I was trying to do to cope with daily life was working. There is evidence from like my school reports with like clear evidence, of me having ADHD. And like I'd gone to like a virtual tech meetup actually in the middle of like COVID, and there were like technical talks, and there's one about neurodiversity, and there's a lady called Rachel Morgan Trimmer who I owe a lot to, and she was talking about it, and I was like, oh, the penny just dropped. I put a request into my GP the next morning. And fortunately, like within a few months, like I had my diagnosis. Like it just wasn't really like a surprise, but like I do carry a lot of like resentment because, it was clearly there throughout like school. I was misdiagnosed with depression. I was on like antidepressants. I was told that I had like anxiety, and like I think I still do kind of like have the anxiety, but that's more of like as a result of being neurodivergent in like a neurotypical society. Actually, there are 3 main reasons why I think my diagnosis was like missed. I'm actually also autistic. Though autism and ADHD categorically don't cancel each other out, they can mask each other very, very well. Because also, ironically, some of my special interests as an autistic person are productivity and systems and efficiency and all of those sorts of things and organization. So people look at me and be like, how on earth are you ADHD? Like, you want to see my Notion? It's just like heaven. And I'm also really fascinated by like psychology. So when people look at me in like social interactions, all of like how I interact with people, especially in big group settings, is a learned behavior. So I've learned that and like I mimic it. A lot of it does not come naturally. The small talk, knowing what questions to ask people, how to be like polite, how to, be really like conversational. I've learned all of those. People don't think autistic people are sociable people. They can be. So that was one of them, sort of them masking like each other. And then the other one is like, I'm naturally like really smart. Found some more of my school reports actually, because I was looking for autistic specific stuff. But there was one which said that, at the age of, I think it was like 5, my reading age was like 9. Like that's almost double. So I was reading far ahead. I always did really, really well in school, but I never used to revise, but never reaching sort of like my potential. People think that being neurodivergent means that you are not smart, which is categorically not true.
That's so wild to me.
It's crazy, right? And then I think the final one, which I think is one of the biggest ones, is, and this is a quote by, I think a lady, she was on one of the sort of news breakfast mornings, but she said that you are diagnosed based on how much you inconvenience other people. I'll say that again. You are diagnosed based on how much you inconvenience other people, not yourself. So when you are a woman or a girl and you internalize your symptoms, I've also got more inattentive ADHD as opposed to hyperactive. You internalize your symptoms and you mask them very well. You're not inconveniencing other people. You are having a detrimental impact on yourself, your mental well-being, your burnout, your sleep, every aspect of your life, but it's not inconveniencing anybody else. So nobody cares. It's a really, really common experience. And I went through a quite a long period actually after my diagnosis, which was just, it's like the stages of grief, to be honest. Like I had denial. I gaslit myself for 6 months actually after my ADHD diagnosis. And then there's the anger and like the resentment. There's the like, what could have been? How would my life have been like different? I would have been so much more like confident as like a child. I would have had so much more like self-esteem. I wouldn't be carrying all of like this baggage and like, you know, in like the workplace and like my relationships and like my friendships. Like, I think it's really normal to actually like feel that way. And like, I think I've mostly moved past it, but like I still carry like a little bit of that. And I think that's really important to call out when, you know, you're around people who are potentially like late diagnosed, is like, we're a little bit angry about the whole situation sometimes.
It's not really fair, is it?
No, it doesn't feel like it's fair, but I think it's real, you know, part of like my journey has been like focusing on, you know, not trying to look back and just like looking into like the future. So like since the diagnosis, I think my life has changed like monumentally. And a huge part of that is like the self-acceptance, like the self-compassion. Like you just have to accept that you can't do things in the same way that other people can do them. Sometimes you may not be able to do like certain things at all. Like they might always be hard. It doesn't matter how many strategies and coping mechanisms and coaching, like you could have all of that in the world. Like you're probably going to find that more difficult, but you're going to be great at other stuff. But it's that self-acceptance, it's finding the balance, the medication part of it as well.
Is that the idea? You get diagnosed, now you get access to medication. Is that the point? Or
yeah, the perfect like intersection for me anyway, and for a lot of people, is like managing with like medication. And it doesn't make you neurotypical, it doesn't make it go away. And this is just ADHD, by the way, because the other ones don't generally have like medication, but
it's not going to be like a magic pill. I don't think. I think you have to accompany it with some like behavioral changes, but maybe you're not able to make those changes about the medicine.
I think it's like an individual's like choice. And there were like studies that showed ADHD increases your chances of like dementia and or like Alzheimer's. But managing ADHD with medication brings that chance of Alzheimer's and or dementia down to normal. Autistic people and people with ADHD also, unfortunately, have shortened lifespans.
Maybe because they're so stressed all the time.
Yeah.
You maintain the peace outside you, but your internal peace isn't there because you're always like managing yourself, you know? You
pour enormous amounts of energy into like masking and appearing normal. Then you're people pleasing because you're used to being reprimanded as a child because of like your condition. So you people please to overcompensate. People with like ADHD are more likely to struggle with substance abuse, like alcohol and like drugs. They're more likely to die from accidental injury.
They're self-medicating almost in a way, isn't it? Yeah.
They're not, you know, they're not symptoms, they're not like traits, but there's strong correlations like between these. And I know that there's like I think he's a psychotherapist or something, Gabor Mate. I personally don't agree with his views on ADHD because he believes that it's purely caused by trauma. And I don't think that is actually true because it's a neurodevelopmental condition. A trauma can't change the brain, but there's, you know, significant like overlap in like neurodivergent people, like autistic people and people with like Tourette's who have trauma as a result of living in a society that is just not built for us.
Yeah.
And this is also like compounded if you are like multiply marginalized. So like I am a woman of color, I'm a first generation like immigrant. So like growing up, you know, in this country, like being like younger with like immigrant parents who have like grown up in a different country, like in a mostly white like school and like area, it's enough to make somebody feel like an outsider. But then like you throw all these other things in there as well. And I think that, you know, that sort of like really compounds like somebody's experience of being a neurodivergent person of color is going to be different to somebody who is, you know, not of like an ethnic minority. Like I think intersectionality is really important when we actually like talk about this because unfortunately, and people are not going to want to hear this, but a lot of when we talk about neurodiversity in the workplace, it's very like white male centered. And that's a problem because not everybody who is neurodivergent is a white male.
How do you not resent that?
Personally, I think some of it is just not intentional. I think sometimes people just they're comfortable with talking about what they know. It's like somebody who is white delivering like anti-racism training. I have lived experience, but that's only my lived experience. So everything that like I do and I talk about, I make sure that I'm using other people's like lived experiences and like bringing those to like the table to like really bring this to life. But some people, they might not know people of color who are neurodivergent. I've attracted like a really diverse neurodivergent like community around me, I think, just sort of like naturally, which I think is really fortunate. But if you don't have that, like, I think you have to like look for it, and it has to be intentional. It has to be for like the right reasons, because it's just so multifaceted. And like, without doing that, you're basically excluding a large proportion of the community that you're supposed to be helping.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question about something you said earlier, which was around learning social skills, basically? Does like everybody have to do that? Like, nobody comes out of like the womb socially adept necessarily?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. But let me ask you something. You know, when you brush your teeth in the morning and the evening, do you think about that when you do it?
Like the habit?
Is it on the list? Is it a habit?
It's habitual.
Is it just, do you just do it without thinking?
Yeah.
So I am 28 years old. It's still part of like a list. It's a conscious every single day. It has to be somewhere. It has to be like a reminder. And you would think after brushing my teeth at least twice a day for 28 years, it would become habitual. Mm-hmm. It's not. Every single decision I make in a day, to drink water, to feed myself, to shower, to get dressed, to brush my teeth, the basic human necessities, is a conscious thought. So things that are absolutely learned behaviors for like everybody, but for some people that they are not always possible to be like completely habitual. There might be people like me, you have to think about brushing your teeth. It's on my routine, on my app, and it's on a list, which sounds like crazy to some people. Like, how could you forget to like brush your teeth? I'm like, I will, because there's multiple things that I have to do in that morning routine, that evening routine. If I don't have it there, I will literally forget something, even if I've done it for every day for the past 10 years, which again, it does sound like crazy to some people. But I think that's actually what makes me like really good at things. Really? I really like routines, but I also have like flexibility and like adaptability like within those. I think I'm a very versatile person. I have been consistently told that I always manage to find the best and most efficient way of like doing something, because I don't really like inefficiencies and I can spot them very easily. And like, who doesn't really like want that in like a team? Because when I see like one way of like doing things, the versatile aspect of my brain is like, oh, well, maybe like do it a little bit that way. So yes, I might have to remind myself to brush my teeth in the morning and night. It's like twice a day. Like, come on, like that's quite a lot, isn't it? I've got an electric toothbrush, which also tells me that it's been 2 minutes, which makes it a lot easier.
You know what strikes me about you, Parul, is that you're talking about this unique challenge, brushing your teeth, and yet you have the most brilliantly white smile I've ever seen. So like, it's like a good example maybe of like the challenge with the benefit.
I have to be really honest, like I do whiten my teeth. So that might be a little bit why.
I respect your dedication to transparency to the very end.
Thank you so much. Well, I think that's really, really important. And like I did have braces like while I was like younger. So swings and roundabouts, just relating kind of like back to what you're saying. I think it's not invalidating it actually, because I think we do, you know, that's a part of like, you know, like growing up, and that's, you know, like learning how to like do things in, you know, like the workplace and how things sort of operate. But for some people, it'll just click like that. That's something that like I found quite difficult. I know that other people found quite difficult, is the unspoken and unwritten rules in the workplace.
I have a follow-up question there, and it's a little bit to do with the self-diagnosis side of this as well. Unfortunately, we won't have time to like get into self-diagnosis and like what that means for your rights and stuff, but that is a very fascinating topic. It's just the kind of theme here really, which is that as we develop our vocabulary for things like ADHD, and as we understand more of the attributes, both to sympathize or better yet empathize with people, we also recognize some of those things in ourselves. What do you think about people? They hear something and they're identifying with ADHD, and like, you know, maybe it's a good thing because it helps people go down that path of diagnosis. Maybe it's also a bad thing because it can cheapen, in quotes, like the kind of real experience that some people go through every day.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, and something to like, I think definitely call attention to, because yes, people without ADHD will show ADHD traits. That doesn't mean that you have it. Same as like, you know, like dyslexia, like some, you know, sometimes I maybe get a little bit sort of lost on the page, or I jumble up my words when I'm reading out loud. Like I categorically know that like I'm not dyslexic. It's like the same as saying that like, oh, you know, my arm hurts sometimes, but it's not broken though. Like to be diagnosed, you have to meet a certain threshold for like all of the conditions in like different areas. I can't remember. There's like specific sort of like numbers, but it's very difficult because you do like a form, but then you go into like your assessment. And I remember looking back at it. So obviously it's very sort of like holistic. I looked back at it and I thought, I filled this in from like me masking perspective. I'm like, this is much worse than it actually is. I definitely hit the thresholds, but I was like, fascinating.
Yeah.
Yes, like people do show the traits sometimes, but like all I will say is if there is an overwhelming amount of evidence which points towards having a neurodivergent condition, it's worth exploring. Is a self-diagnosis like valid? If you are in the UK, you will know that the waitlist for any specialist in the NHS is horrific, but particularly bad for, neurodivergent conditions. I know in some areas ADHD is like 5+ years. And a private diagnosis is not accessible to everybody. And then you actually have to pay for private medication until you're titrated, which is basically code word for stable on medication. Then maybe your GP will accept a shared care agreement. Only at that point you can get NHS prescriptions, but they might still reject it. So it'd be thousands and thousands of pounds worth off, which not everybody can actually afford. I have a medical ADHD diagnosis. I'm self-diagnosed autistic because I realized that about 6 months ago, but I gaslit myself for like a year. I'm waiting for my assessment and I'm very comfortable saying like I'm self-diagnosed. I know there's people who are going to hear that and they're going to roll their eyes. They're going to be like, oh, you're spending too much time on the TikTok and like everybody's self-diagnosed and everybody wants to be autistic. I'm like, do you know what? With all due respect, I don't really care at this point because I know myself and like I've done enough. I'm starting, like my own business. Like I don't have money to throw around on a private diagnosis. A lot of people don't. What that self-diagnosis of autism has meant for me is that same sort of like self-acceptance. But it's really strange is that weight lifted off my shoulders for like self-acceptance and self-compassion feels greater after the autism thing as opposed to like the ADHD thing. Like I'm not really sure what it is. From my personal perspective, is like my autism has been more stereotyped and like more like misconceived. And it's actually really exhausting to sort of like mask it. It's a lot of it is less socially acceptable, perhaps, let's say. And I've like been very comfortable sort of like unmasking. And I can't do that without like the self-diagnosis. Like, yes, I will get that diagnosis eventually and it'll be a piece of paper, but like it doesn't change it. I was always autistic and I always will be. And I really encourage people to change their perceptions on like, you still have legal protection in the workplace. If you are self-diagnosed, you still have access to a government grant, which is called Access to Work, which we won't have time to go into, but I will link that. You can still get that grant with being like self-diagnosed because even the government now, people can't actually get like a self-diagnosis.
I was going to offer not a counterpoint of view, but like I resonate with a lot of traits of ADHD. And one thing I understand about the diagnosis as well is that sometimes they'll interview someone who knows you or they'll look at your childhood like reports and stuff like that. But I don't want to know. Like I don't want an official, even if that was the case, I don't want, because I think a lot of my success has happened because of those things, not in spite of them, if that makes sense.
No, I think that's really good. I think it's always really good to hear like the other, perspective of it. Like we're two different people, we have different experiences. It's been like really potentially like really, really important for me, but maybe recognizing that the reasons behind that might be because it impacts us in like different ways. And this is not about you or invalidating your experience like at all, but like we know that like women of color in the workplace are like held to like higher standards. Like, you have to be polite, you have to be like forthcoming, you have to be like agreeable, you have to be like all of these things, because if you're not, then like the outcomes are like quite detrimental. Being held back from like promotions, not getting like pay reviews, poor performance reviews, biased feedback. Like,
fantastic point.
There's so much research around this that actually shows, and like, I'm not saying that like you haven't experienced that, and like you probably have, like who hasn't, but the repercussions of not being like diagnosed and not like sort of like disclosing for people from, like minority groups is maybe a little bit different. And maybe that's why for some people it might be more important to pursue a diagnosis. But I completely respect you for like, not wanting to do it as well. I think that's so important. And like, I think it's really nice that you kind of, know what you want, and, nobody else should be able to tell you otherwise.
Yeah, I love that. Parul, we're almost out of time, unfortunately, but is there anything else you wanted to share before we go?
The thing that I wanted to share is that I'm really grateful for you for giving me this like platform to have this conversation. I'm really grateful for everybody like listening to this, because you might not even be like neurodivergent yourself, but you are like being curious. And I think asking the questions and like starting the conversation, which sometimes people are a little bit like scared about, it can make a monumental difference in people's lives, like people like me. So I really commend you for that. And thank you so much for having me back on today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. I think the benefit of an episode like this is, apart from understanding yourself a little better, maybe being a bit gentler with yourself, loving yourself a bit more, maybe pursuing a diagnosis if that's what you want to do. Even if it doesn't relate to you at all, you're like, I don't relate to any of this, but then maybe you get a bit more of an understanding of the people you work with or that you collaborate or interact with every day. I think the world's a little bit better if we understand each other and sympathize or empathize with each other. So yeah, really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for everybody for listening. And if you do like relate to anything that like I've said, or like you have any questions, I know that you usually put like the LinkedIn and everything in the description of like the podcast, like please do feel free to reach out, and I'm always more than happy to chat.
Thank you so much.
That was the Scrimba Podcast, episode 152. Make sure to check out the show notes for the resources mentioned in this interview, as well as all the ways to connect with Parul. If you're enjoying our show, the best thing you can do to support us is to tell somebody about it. You can do it in person, in your favorite Discord community, or on social media. And as long as your Twitter and LinkedIn posts contain the words Scrimba and podcast, we will find them and you might get a shout out right here on the show. The Scrimba Podcast is hosted by Alex Booker and produced by me, Jan Arsedovic. Keep coding, and we'll see you next time.